Chapter 1. Mr. Verloc. Mr. Verloc owned a small shop in Soho, London. He lived there with his wife, Winnie, her brother, Stevie, and her mother. The shop sold newspapers, books, pictures of dancers, and small packets. It wasn't very respectable and didn't get many customers. Most of the customers were men, and the younger ones often felt shy if Winnie was there. The shop also had a back room and a staircase that led to their living quarters. This shop was not Mr. Verloc's main work. He used it as a cover for his secret job. Mr. Verloc thought of himself as someone important, but he was lazy and did very little. He liked living a quiet, comfortable life with Winnie taking care of him. Winnie was a calm and neat woman with shiny dark hair. Her mother was large and had swollen legs, so she rarely moved around. Stevie, Winnie's younger brother, was kind but not very clever. He was easily distracted and could not hold a job. Before marrying Mr. Verloc, Winnie and her mother ran a small business renting rooms to gentlemen. Mr. Verloc was one of their tenants, and he stayed for a long time. Eventually, he and Winnie got married. After the marriage, Mr. Verloc made them sell the business. He said it was inconvenient for his secret work, which he only described as political. Then he moved Winnie, her mother, and Stevie to live with him above the shop. Winnie's mother liked the arrangement because she didn't have to worry about Winnie or Stevie's future anymore. She was also glad that Mr. Verloc and Winnie didn't have children, as this allowed them to care for Stevie. Stevie had always been delicate and struggled in life. His first job as a messenger failed because he forgot the messages. He often got distracted by cats and dogs, following them until he got lost. His second job ended when he was caught setting off fireworks inside an office. After that, he stayed at home with Winnie and Mr. Verloc. One morning, Mr. Verloc left the shop and walked through London. He was going to the embassy of a foreign country. He had a letter in his pocket asking him to come. When he arrived, Mr. Verloc showed the letter to the man at the door and was taken to a small room. An important man at the desk told him, "Your reports are useless. They say nothing new." The man said the embassy needed something big to happen, like an explosion, to scare the public and force the government to act. The man suggested an attack on the Greenwich Observatory. He said, people respected science, and this would shock them. The man gave Mr. Verloc 1 month to act. Mr. Verloc left the embassy feeling worried and angry. He slowly walked back home. When he returned, he sat in silence in the back room. Winnie was cooking, and Stevie was nearby, but Mr. Verloc didn't speak. He was deep in thought about what he had been told to do. Chapter 2. Mr. Verloc's Friends. Later on that evening, some of Mr. Verloc's friends came to the shop. They considered themselves to be anarchists and liked to sit around discussing the state of society. Michaelis was a large, pale man who was supposed to be in prison. He was allowed out for good behavior, but he still had to report to the police now and again. He became very fat while he was in prison, and even after he came out, he did not lose any weight. A very wealthy old lady who was interested in all types of people in society looked after him. Michaelis stayed at her cottage in the country just outside London. In front of the fireplace sat Ossipon. a man who had a reputation for seducing rich young women. Opposite him was Carl Jund, a fierce old man with no teeth and no hair. He was a man of angry words, but was not known for being a man of action. It was hot in the room, so Verloc opened the door to let some air in. They could now see into the kitchen, where Stevie was sitting quietly at the table, drawing circles on a piece of paper. The men talked for a while, often only listening to themselves and no one else. They discussed injustice in society, revolutions, reform, the past and the future. Jund became angrier and more passionate, causing Stevie to stop what he was doing and listen in horror. One by one, the anarchists left. Mr. Verloc envied them. It was easy for them, talking, doing nothing, being looked after by various women. They did not know Mr. Vladimir. Verloc now had to do something, and he had a woman to look after. Verloc thought about going to bed. He looked around at his shop, noticing the few silver coins in the till. It was an easy business to run, but it did not make much money. He needed his other job at the embassy. Verloc was about to go to bed when he realized that Stevie was still downstairs, agitatedly walking around the kitchen table. Mr. Verloc did not know what to say to him. He went upstairs and woke up Winnie. "Winnie! Winnie!" She woke up confused. "Your brother is still downstairs. I don't know what to do with him," said Verloc. Winnie got out of bed and went downstairs. A few minutes later, she came back up and got into bed. "That poor boy was very excited tonight," she said. "He hears too much of what these anarchists say. It upsets him." Verloc turned, knowing that he would not sleep that night. He could not stop thinking about Mr. Vladimir and what he wanted him, Verloc, to do. Stevie was the least of his problems. "Shall I put out the light now, dear?" asked Mrs. Verloc. "Yes," said Verloc after a long pause. "Put it out." A month later, Ossipon walked into a restaurant and went to the room downstairs. He looked around and then went to sit with a small man with glasses. This man called himself the Professor. He too was an anarchist. The professor knew a lot about explosives. "Have you heard the news?" Ossipon asked the professor. "No," replied the professor. "I stayed in bed all morning. They've been shouting the news in the streets. I bought the paper and came in here. Then I saw you." Ossipon pulled the newspaper out of his pocket. "Here it is. A bomb in Greenwich Park at 11:30. The effects of the explosion were felt as far as Romney Road. It left an enormous hole in the ground under a tree, and all around were pieces of a man's body. An attempt to blow up the observatory, they say." I'm not sure I believe that." The professor said nothing. "I had no any idea something like this was being planned," he continued. "Have you been giving your explosives away to any idiot who asks for them recently?" said Ossipon. Still the professor said nothing. "You have," said Ossipon. "So what if I have? All you do is talk, make plans, and do nothing. It's very easy for people like you and Michaelis. If someone asks me for the stuff, I give it to them." "Can you describe the person you gave the stuff to?" asked Ossipon. "Describe him," he repeated slowly. "Well, I don't see why not now he's obviously dead. I can describe him to you in one word: Verloc." Ossipon sat back in his chair, shocked. Verloc. Impossible. The professor nodded. Yes, he's the person. You can't say that I was giving my stuff away to any idiot who asked for it. Verloc is a well-known anarchist. Well, yes, agreed Ossipon. He was married as well, you know. I think it was with her money that he started the shop. I wonder what that woman will do now. He paused and thought for a while. Did Verloc say anything to you? Give you some idea of his intentions? He asked. He told me he was going to blow up a building, said the professor. He described the explosives he prepared for Verloc. What do you think happened? Ossipon interrupted. I don't know. The timer was set for 20 minutes. He had time to place the bomb, set it, and then get away. However, if it was dropped, it would explode immediately, said the professor, getting up and putting on his coat. I don't know what Verloc was thinking. There's some mystery there, but he's dead. The best thing to do is to say we didn't know him. No doubt, the police know that we had nothing to do with this. But what they will actually say is another thing, said Ossipon. I must speak to Michaelis and tell him what's happened. Ossipon did not know what to do. He did not want to go to Verloc's shop. Perhaps it was a police trap. Then he thought, if the man in the park was in so many pieces, the police might not be able to identify him. If so, there was no reason for Verloc's shop to be watched. Still, I wonder what I should do now, he asked himself. See how much the woman's worth, said the professor. He got up and left the room. Ossipon remained still for a moment before he too got up and left. Chapter 3. Inspector Heat. Inspector Heat's department received a telegram from Greenwich at 11 that morning, telling them about the attack. Inspector Heat was annoyed. Only a week before he had told a government official that there was no chance of anarchist activity. We can arrest any one of these anarchists, sir, at any time of the day or night. We know exactly where they are and what they're doing. The government official was pleased. He believed Inspector Heat because it was what he wanted to believe. Now Inspector Heat felt this explosion had embarrassed him. This was not the only reason for Inspector Heat's bad mood. He was also hungry, but he did not want to eat after what he had seen at the hospital. He did not often see the mutilated remains of human beings. When the sheet was lifted from the table, Heat was shocked. Underneath was a pile of rags with some unidentifiable pieces of human flesh. The local policeman who was first at the scene after the explosion said, "He's all there, every bit of him. It was a difficult job." Inspector Heat tried hard not to vomit. The man, whoever he was, obviously died instantly. But it seemed impossible to believe that a human body could become this pile of fragments without feeling incredible pain. The policeman continued talking. I spoke to an old woman. She said she saw two men coming out of the train station. One of them was large, but the other one was thin and blonde. The large one was carrying a metal can in one hand. Well, there he is, continued the policeman. All of him that I could see. Look at that foot there. I picked up the legs first. There were pieces of him everywhere. I didn't know where to begin. He stumbled, the policeman said. The roots on those trees come up above the ground. He stumbled over one of them, fell down, and that thing he was carrying exploded right under his chest. Inspector Heat picked up one of the rags. It was the collar of a coat. Inside the collar was another piece of material with an address on it. He turned to the window for a better light and looked closer. The inspector could now dearly see what was written. He was greatly surprised. He quickly tore off the piece and put it in his pocket. He turned around and put the collar back on the table. "Cover it up," he said, and he left the room. Inspector Heat took a train back into central London. When he got off the train, he was still thinking intensely and still feeling sick. Inspector Heat did not think much of anarchists. He did not really think anarchy was a serious problem. To him it seemed foolish, but it was this foolishness which excited the public. Anarchy and attacks like this affected people in high places. Heat's immediate problem was what to say to the assistant commissioner, his superior officer. Heat arrived at the headquarters and went straight to the assistant commissioner's private room. "It seems you were right when you said that none of the London anarchists were involved in this," said the assistant commissioner. "But, to the public, that just means you don't know who is responsible. Unless," he added, "you have brought something useful from Greenwich." Inspector Heat told him about his investigation so far. He thought that the two men had probably left each other close to the observatory walls. He thought that the large man had left the park quickly without being seen, and had left the thin man at the scene to do the job on his own. He'd explained that the ticket collectors at the train station had been questioned. They also remembered the two men. The big man had got out carrying the bright metal can in his hand and had then given it to the younger man to carry. The ticket collector had collected the tickets from the two men. The tickets showed that they came from a small station in the country. All this agreed with what the old woman had told the policeman in Greenwich. Here, the assistant commissioner interrupted. "All this depends on what the old woman said. Is she reliable? And you say that these men came from a little station in the country. It seems strange that two foreign anarchists came from there," he said. "Yes, sir," said Chief Inspector Heat, "but it's not so strange if you consider that the anarchist Michaelis is staying in a cottage in that area." At the mention of the name Michaelis, the assistant commissioner became much more interested. Chapter 4. The Assistant Commissioner. The assistant commissioner was married. His wife's name was Annie, and she was well connected. She knew the rich old lady who took an interest in Michaelis. The old lady was interested in all sorts of people: royalty, artists, criminals, scientists, and musicians. People of all types and ages were welcome in her house. She listened to them, understood and learnt from them. In her own words, she liked to watch what was happening in the world. Her house was probably the only place where an assistant commissioner of the police might mix socially with a known anarchist. The old lady liked Michaelis very much and did not think he was a danger to society, but instead someone to feel sorry for. The assistant commissioner knew that the old lady would be very upset if Michaelis was involved in this bombing at Greenwich. The old lady was very useful to the assistant commissioner because she made his married life much easier. She had a powerful influence over Annie and her moods. "If Michaelis goes back to prison, the old lady will never forgive me," thought the assistant commissioner. Then, more precisely, he thought, "If Inspector Heat makes the decision, Michaelis will go back to prison, and she'll never forgive me." Inspector Heat and the assistant commissioner did not speak for some time. Eventually, the assistant commissioner said, "Do you think Michaelis is involved in this bombing?" "Well, sir," replied Heat, "we have enough information to make an arrest. A man like Michaelis has no right to be free anyway." "You'll need some proper evidence, though," said the assistant commissioner. "Oh, there will be no problem finding evidence against someone like him," said Inspector Heat. To Inspector Heat, it seemed a perfect opportunity to put Michaelis back in prison. He thought it was only right and legal, and it also gave the public someone to blame for the bombing in Greenwich Park. It would also be good for Inspector Heat's reputation. "Now, why don't you like this man Michaelis?" asked the assistant commissioner. "What evidence do you have against him? Apart from the fact that the two suspects came from a railway station a few miles away from where Michaelis is living at the moment." "With this sort of man," said the inspector, "that's enough to convince me." "Really?" asked the assistant commissioner, twisting the ends of his mustache. The inspector felt uncomfortable. "Of course," Heat replied slowly. "I haven't sent my men out into the country to arrest him yet. Is there some reason for not arresting Michaelis? Perhaps something that I don't know about?" "There's no reason at all as far as I know," replied the assistant commissioner. "Now let's see what you discovered at the scene of the explosion, Heat." Inspector Heat realized he was not going to have the satisfaction of arresting Michaelis for something he had not done. He decided to tell the truth. "I took an address from the remains of the body," he said, pulling the burnt rag from his pocket. "This was attached to the coat of the man who was blown to pieces. Of course, it's possible that the coat didn't belong to him or that it was stolen, but I don't think that is the case." He put it on the table. "I took it from the hospital without anyone seeing me." The assistant commissioner looked at it in silence. Only the number 32 and the name of Brett Street were written on the piece of cloth. He was surprised. How extraordinary. Why would somebody go about labeled like this? He asked. What is at number 32 Brett Street anyway? It's a shop, sir. The assistant commissioner sensed that Inspector Heat had something else to say, so he waited for more information. Inspector Heat then told him about Mr. Verloc's business, his appearance, his work at the embassy, and his connection to the inspector himself. "And how long have you been in contact with this embassy spy?" asked the assistant commissioner. "For about 7 years. I met him one day when Baron Stott Wartenheim was the ambassador. I described him to my friend in the French police, and he told me that the man was a secret agent for one of the foreign embassies in London. I went to his shop one night and told him who I was. Verloc told me he was married and settled now, and just wanted to run his business. I promised him that if he didn't do anything really terrible, the police would leave him alone." "And what do you get in return?" asked the assistant commissioner. "Well, he can usually help me by giving me information," said Heat. The assistant commissioner smiled to himself, thinking that Inspector Heat's good reputation was probably mainly thanks to the secret agent Verloc. "Well, he didn't help you much this time," observed the assistant commissioner. "Does he live above his shop?" "Verloc? Yes, he does." "Is the shop being watched?" "Oh, no. I don't believe he knows anything about this attack," said Heat. "So, how do you explain this?" asked the assistant commissioner, pointing at the piece of cloth with Verloc's address on it. "I can't explain it, sir," replied Heat. The assistant commissioner stood up suddenly and decided what he was going to do. He sent Inspector Heat away and told him to return the next morning. Not long after, he left the building. The assistant commissioner went to see a man called Sir Ethelred. He was a very important man. He was the Secretary of State. "I want you to tell me one thing. Can we expect more explosions like this?" Sir Ethelred asked. "No," said the assistant commissioner. "Not as far as I know." Said Sir Ethelred. "Only a month ago, Inspector Heat told me that nothing like this was even possible. In the last hour or so, I've learnt something about this anarchist attack which is unusual. I need to talk to you about it because I believe it involves someone at a foreign embassy," said the assistant commissioner. "I want to investigate this myself," he continued. "If it's left to Inspector Heat, he'll just try to blame some well-known anarchists. The person who carried out this attack destroyed himself by accident. Also, by accident, an address on his clothing was discovered. The address is for a shop in Brett Street, where a certain secret agent lives. I think he'll be able to explain the real reasons for this attack and who is behind it." Sir Ethelred agreed. "I must start straight away tonight," said the assistant commissioner. Sir Ethelred looked at him. "I'll be here until late this evening. Come back then with your discoveries." The assistant commissioner left the building and returned to his office. "Has Heat gone yet?" he asked. "Yes, sir. He went away about half an hour ago." "Perfect." The assistant commissioner sent a note to his wife to say that he was not going to be at dinner. He left his office and went towards Brett Street. Chapter 5. Mrs. Verloc's mother moves out. Mrs. Verloc's mother was worried. She thought Mr. Verloc had too many people to take care of, Winnie, Stevie, and herself. She decided to move out to make life easier for him. She found a place to live through a charity for elderly women. She didn't tell Winnie until everything was ready. When Winnie heard the news, she was shocked. "Why are you leaving? Aren't you comfortable here?" she asked. Her mother explained that it was better for everyone. Winnie was upset, but didn't say much. On the day of the move, Stevie went with them to help. During the ride, Stevie got upset when he saw the weak horse pulling the carriage. "Don't whip the horse," he told the driver. Stevie jumped out of the carriage, shouting, "It's too heavy!" Winnie calmed him down and told him to get back in. She warned him not to upset Mr. Verloc. At the new house, Stevie felt sad for the thin horse and the poor driver. He told Winnie, "The world is bad for poor people." Winnie tried to comfort him but said, "That's just how life is." Stevie stayed upset, but they returned home. That night, the house felt different without Winnie's mother. Stevie sat quietly, missing her. Chapter 6. Like father and son, Mr. Verloc came home after 10 days. Stevie was happy to see him and helped with his bag and hat. Winnie told Mr. Verloc, "Stevie really admires you." Later, Mr. Verloc went for a walk. Winnie said, "Take Stevie with you." At first, Mr. Verloc wasn't sure, but he agreed. They left together, and Winnie thought, they look like father and son. In the next few days, Stevie and Mr. Verloc went on walks together. Mr. Verloc seemed to enjoy Stevie's company. One day, Mr. Verloc said, Stevie should stay in the countryside for a while. He told Winnie that Michaelis could take care of Stevie. Winnie liked the idea because Michaelis was kind to Stevie. The next day, Mr. Verloc took Stevie to the countryside. Winnie told Stevie, "Don't get your clothes dirty." Stevie seemed happy but a little confused. After Stevie left, Winnie was often alone. She missed Stevie, but she thought it was good for him. Mr. Verloc kept going out for long walks. On the day of the bombing, Mr. Verloc left early and came back late. Winnie didn't know what had happened. When he returned, she asked, "Did you see Stevie?" "No," Mr. Verloc said softly and went to the back room. Winnie thought he seemed different, but she didn't ask more questions. Chapter 7. Mrs. Verloc Meets. Inspector Heat, Mrs. Verloc was sitting quietly in the shop when the bell at the door rang. A man entered. He was not a customer. It was Inspector Heat from the police. "Is your husband home?" asked Inspector Heat. "No, he has gone out," replied Mrs. Verloc. "That's unfortunate," said the inspector. "I came to ask him some questions." Mrs. Verloc looked confused. "Questions? About what?" Inspector Heat sighed. "You don't read the newspapers, do you?" he asked. "No, I don't," said Mrs. Verloc. The inspector explained that there had been a bombing in Greenwich Park. Mrs. Verloc listened but said nothing. Inspector Heat then told her that a piece of clothing was found at the scene of the explosion. It had her address on it. "That must belong to my brother Stevie," said Mrs. Verloc. "Where is your brother now?" asked the inspector. "He's staying with a friend in the countryside," she replied. The inspector continued asking questions. Slowly, Mrs. Verloc started to realize the terrible truth. Stevie was the person who had died in the explosion. Inspector Heat explained more details about the bombing. He told Mrs. Verloc that 2 men were seen in the park. One of them must have been her husband, Mr. Verloc. Mrs. Verloc was in shock. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Tears filled her eyes as she sat silently. Then, the shop door opened again, and Mr. Verloc walked in. Inspector Heat looked at him and said, "We need to talk." Chapter 8. The Secret Agent's End. The Assistant Commissioner went to meet his boss, Sir Ethelred. He explained what he learned from Mr. Verloc. Mr. Verloc had confessed everything. The bombing was his plan, but it was Mr. Vladimir from the embassy who ordered it. The bomb was supposed to scare the public and force the government to be stricter. Mr. Verloc did not want Stevie, his brother-in-law, to get hurt. He thought Stevie could place the bomb and safely walk away, but Stevie tripped and the bomb exploded. The Assistant Commissioner let Mr. Verloc go home to his wife. Sir Ethelred was worried that Mr. Verloc might run away, but the Assistant Commissioner didn't think so. He believed Mr. Verloc would go home. When Mr. Verloc returned home, Winnie, his wife, already knew what had happened to Stevie. She was devastated and couldn't stop thinking about her brother's horrible death. Mr. Verloc tried to explain and calm her down, but he didn't understand how much she was hurting. In her deep pain and anger, Winnie picked up a knife and killed Mr. Verloc. Afterward, she was scared and didn't know what to do. Winnie decided to run away. She met Ossipon, a man who used to visit Mr. Verloc. She begged him to help her escape. Ossipon agreed, but he was secretly thinking about the money Winnie might have. They went to the train station together. Ossipon took the money and told Winnie to get on the train alone. But as the train started moving, Ossipon jumped off and ran away with the money, leaving Winnie alone. Later, it was reported that a woman had jumped from a boat and drowned. Ossipon was haunted by the news and couldn't stop thinking about it. He felt guilty and scared, knowing he had left her to die. Chapter 9. An act of madness or desperation, Mrs. Verloc was no longer calm. She was now afraid. Verloc lay dead on the sofa. She had committed murder. Mrs. Verloc knew what happened to murderers. They were hanged. She was afraid of hanging. She decided to go and throw herself into the river from one of the bridges. She went out the door of the shop and started walking. Then she thought about escape. Murderers went abroad and disappeared. But where could she go? She knew no one. Suddenly, she felt someone take her arm. She looked up. It was Ossipon. "Mrs. Verloc," he exclaimed. "What are you doing here?" Ossipon had always found Mrs. Verloc very attractive. Thinking that her husband had been killed in the explosion, Ossipon thought he could take advantage of this situation. "Were you coming to the shop?" asked Mrs. Verloc. "Yes, as soon as I read the paper. Can I ask where you were going?" "Don't ask me," cried Mrs. Verloc. She put her hand on his arm. "Can you help me, Ossipon?" "Of course I'll help you in your trouble," he replied. "And do you know what my trouble is?" she asked. "I've spoken to the professor and he told me what happened. I was coming to your shop. You know I've always felt great affection for you." "I thought so," she said softly. Mrs. Verloc thought Ossipon was her savior. He would help her escape. "You knew he was dead then?" she asked. "You guessed what I had to do." "I had to. You must help me to get away." Ossipon was confused, but then he often found women confusing. He did not understand why she was so upset. "How did you first hear about it?" he asked her. "From the police. Chief Inspector Heat came. He told me—" Mrs. Verloc cried in between breaths. "Oh, Tom, there were bits of his body everywhere." "The police already." "Yes, and another man too, one of those embassy people, I think." Ossipon was shocked. "Embassy? What do you mean? What did he say? What did he do?" "I can't remember." "Nothing. I don't care. Don't ask me," she said tiredly. Ossipon did not know what was going on. How much did she know? Why did she have to get away? Ossipon thought that the shop must be a dangerous place with policemen and people from embassies. But perhaps the Verlocs had savings. Perhaps he could get away with the woman and her money. "You must hide me somewhere until morning," said Mrs. Verloc. "I can't take you where I live," said Ossipon. "I share the room with a friend. But you must. Don't you care for me at all? Perhaps we can take a room somewhere. But the truth is, I don't have enough money. And there's the journey tomorrow." She did not answer. Then she put her hand to her chest. "But I have," she said. "I have enough money. He gave it to me, all the money that was in the bank." "Well then, we're saved," said Ossipon. "You'll save me, Tom. Don't let them get me. I'm so afraid. We'll get on the boat to France from Southampton. The boat leaves about midnight. We'll have plenty of time. I must shut the shop door first. I forgot to close it," said Mrs. Verloc. They arrived at the shop. "Oh no, I've left a light on. Tom, go through and turn it off. I can't go in there." She pushed Ossipon towards the door. He did not know what to think of her strange behavior. He walked into the back room and saw Verloc lying dead on the sofa. Ossipon did not like this situation at all. He had only been with Mrs. Verloc for 20 minutes and already he was mixed up in such dangers. He was terrified. "Don't let them hang me, Tom. Take me out of the country. I'll work for you. I'll care for you. I've no one in the world." She moved towards him. "Was he asleep?" he asked. "No. He was sitting on that sofa after killing my Stevie." Suddenly, Ossipon understood. It was her brother that died in the park. He was terrified of Mrs. Verloc. He thought quickly, "Come on, let's go or we'll miss the train." "Where are we going, Tom?" "Let's get to Paris first and then we'll see. Go and see if there's anyone outside." She went. "It's all clear," she said. They called a carriage and got in. "When we arrive at the station," said Ossipon, "you go ahead of me, as if you don't know me. I'll get the tickets, and I'll put yours in your hand as I pass you. Wait until 10 minutes before the train leaves, then get on. I'll get on after you and meet you on the train. There may be people looking for you. Do you understand?" "Yes, Tom." "Perhaps you can give me the money for the tickets now," added Ossipon. Mrs. Verloc handed him the wallet that she took from her dress. Everything went according to plan. Ossipon and Mrs. Verloc sat together in a small compartment on the train, waiting for it to move off. 8 minutes later, the train started to move slowly. Ossipon felt the train begin to roll more quickly. He walked across the carriage, opened the door, and jumped out. He also managed somehow to close the door behind him. He landed on the platform, out of breath but unhurt. Ossipon left the station, his pockets full of more money than he could count. He walked to his house and went to sleep. 2 weeks later, Ossipon was sitting with the professor in a restaurant. He pulled out an old newspaper from his pocket. The professor looked over. The paper looked like it had been read many times before. "What's that paper?" he said. "Anything in it?" "Nothing. Nothing at all. It's 10 days old. I forgot it was in my pocket." But he did not throw it away. Before he put it back in his pocket, he looked quickly at the last lines of a paragraph. "It seems that a mystery will always surround this act of madness or desperation." These were the words at the end of an article with the headline, "Suicide of Lady Passenger from Cross-Channel Boat." The suicide of a lady, this act of madness or desperation, the words went round and round in Ossipon's head. He could not think, work, sleep, or eat. He got up and left the restaurant. He walked without looking where he put his feet. He did not feel tired. He did not feel anything. He saw nothing and heard nothing, only those words in his head. a mystery, this act of madness or desperation. The end.